Mr. James always used to sleep in the fields during the harvest season. It was the month of November, and wheat was swaying in his fields. Every year his crops were excellent, and they sold at good prices. Because of this, the villagers were envious of him. This year too, his crop was great. There was a man in the village named Robert, who was Mr. James's nephew. They had a 10-year-old feud over the division of land, and even now they hadn't reconciled. Mr. James was a kind-hearted man, busy with his fields and family, but Robert was constantly plotting his downfall. This time, Robert paid some men to set fire to Mr. James's fields. That night, Mr. James was sleeping in the fields. It was the middle of the night, and the loud sound of crickets echoed through the quiet atmosphere. Suddenly, Mr. James woke up due to some movement. Grabbing his stick, he stood up, came out of his hut and looked around. Quietly, he moved toward the source of the noise. After walking a short distance, he saw 2 or 3 men preparing to light torches and talking amongst themselves. "Tonight, we will burn this field to the ground," they said. Mr. James was startled to hear this and ran toward them. "Stop! If you set fire to my fields, I will not leave you alive." Hearing Mr. James's voice, the men started to run, but he managed to catch one of them and beat him with his stick. The man fell to the ground. Mr. James tied him up in his hut for the night and called for a village council the next day. The man confessed that Robert had paid him to set the field on fire. According to the council's decision, Robert was punished. His head was shaved, and his face was smeared with black dye. After the council was over, as Mr. James was heading home, Robert stopped him in the middle of the road, furious. "Mr. James, you've reignited an old feud. Be careful now. The consequences will be terrible." Mr. James said nothing and walked away. A few days later it was evening, and the sun was setting. A faint dark shadow spread across the land, and strange sounds of insects filled the air. Mr. James was walking through his fields when he saw a bright light from a distance. When he approached, he found that the crops in that area were ruined, and red powder and lemons were scattered around. The ground had been slightly dug up, and something was buried underneath. He immediately understood that someone had done some kind of dark ritual there. Mr. James began to dig the ground. As he removed some soil, he saw something black beneath. He used a stick to pull it out, and it was the half-dead body of a crow. Its blood had dried into the soil. Shocked, Mr. James quickly picked it up with the stick and started heading out of the field. It was a cold night, and the darkness was deepening. As he walked, he muttered to himself, "I haven't harmed anyone. So why is someone doing this against me? It must be Robert's doing." When he reached the edge of the field to throw the crow away, his hand suddenly froze, as if some invisible force had gripped it. He turned around and screamed in horror when he saw what was happening. The dead crow had come back to life and was holding his hand with its wings. Its eyes were burning, as if some demonic spirit was glaring at him. The crow pecked at his hand with its sharp beak, and Mr. James's hand was deeply cut. He shook his hand violently, and the crow fell to the ground and fluttered away. Mr. James, trembling with fear and pain, ran toward his house. The path he had always taken now seemed terrifying. Somehow, he managed to reach home. As soon as he entered, he called for his wife, who rushed out in a panic. He collapsed, unconscious. Seeing him like that, she ran out to call the healer. A short while later, the healer arrived and examined Mr. James's wound. He expressed concern and said, "This wound is deep, but how did it happen?" Mr. James's wife replied, "I don't know. When he came home from the fields, he was already injured and fainted as soon as he called me. The healer applied ointment and gave Mr. James medicine to drink, saying he should be fine by morning." That night, everyone went to bed. The house was silent, except for the sounds of insects. Around midnight, Mr. James woke up to the sound of the crow again. The rest of the family was in a deep sleep, but the crow's call was coming from outside. Mr. James opened the door slowly and looked around. There was nothing, but the eerie sound persisted. He walked toward the back of the house, where there was a small room where he kept farming tools. He slowly opened the door to that room and fumbled around for the light switch. Once he turned on the light, he saw a terrifying black shadow in the corner of the room, standing against the wall. It was the same crow-like sound coming from it. As soon as Mr. James saw it, the shadow transformed into the shape of the crow and vanished. He froze in fear and quickly ran inside, locking the door behind him. He went to his elderly mother and woke her up, saying, "Mom, Mom, wake up!" She was fast asleep under her blanket, but eventually she woke up and asked, "What is it? Why are you waking me up at this hour? Are you still in pain?" Mr. James replied with a trembling voice, "No, Mom, I am scared. Last evening I found a dead crow in the field. When I tried to throw it away, it came back to life and grabbed my hand. It pecked at my hand and blood started to flow. Now I hear the same crow calling. It feels like it's coming after me. I'm so afraid. Please save me. Someone is after me. It's a ghost trying to kill me." Hearing this, his mother was alarmed and immediately rushed to wake up his wife, Emily. Emily was frightened and came running. "What happened?" she asked. Mr. James's mother said, "Quick, get up, something has happened to James." Emily rushed into the room, where her husband was trembling and covered in fever. She touched his forehead and noticed he was burning with fever. She and her mother-in-law put him back to bed. The next morning, an elder from the village suggested that a priest be called. Emily rushed to the priest, who agreed to perform a ritual. That night, as the ritual began in the same field where the dark ritual had been done, a sudden storm arose. The priest chanted prayers, and suddenly a dark force emerged from Mr. James's body. The priest redirected it back to its sender. The next morning, Robert's body was found near a river, lifeless. The villagers were shocked, realizing that playing with dark forces had led to a terrible fate. That's all for today, friends. We'll meet again with a new story. If you have any unusual incidents that are not ordinary at all, email us your story. We will feature it.